On our newscast tonight, the newly formed North-South Joint Committee on Managing the Gaeseong Industrial Complex will hold its first meeting on Monday. The two sides will discuss issues related to the joint complex, including the creation of necessary subcommittees. And Western powers appear to be gearing up for a strike on Syria, but a resolution that would authorize military force fails at the UN Security Council. Korean consumers voiced their concerns about the safety of Japanese fish imports after Tokyo finally admit it has no clue about how much contaminated water leaked, how radioactive it was, or where it even went. Stay with us for these stories and more.
It is 5 a.m. in New York City, noon in Damascus, and 6 on a Thursday evening here in Seoul. Welcome to Early Edition at 6. I'm Kim Hyun-ji.
And I'm Daniel Chan. Thank you for joining us. The first meeting for the Joint Gaeseong Committee is right around the corner.
Right. The two Koreas are making progress with the normalization of their jointly run Gaeseong Industrial Complex.
They will convene the first meeting of their joint committee on the factory zone next week. Our Hwang Sung-hee has the details.
The two Koreas will convene a first meeting of their joint committee on the management of the Gaeseong Industrial Complex on Monday in Gaeseong. The two sides agreed on the specifics of the joint committee on Wednesday and exchanged their finalized documents on Thursday.
North Korea agreed this morning to hold the first meeting of the Joint Committee on the Gaeseong Industrial Complex on September 2nd, as proposed by the South.
The Joint Committee, which will be headed by Kim Ki-young from the South and Park Chol-soo from the North, will allow the Koreas to oversee the management of their joint business park together. The formation of such a committee was agreed upon by the two sides earlier this month as one of the safeguards against future unilateral closures. Operations at the factory zone have been suspended since April after the North unilaterally withdrew all of its workers amid an escalation in inter-Korean tensions. To prevent such a shutdown from happening again, the Joint Committee will hold a meeting once every quarter and hold additional discussions if needed. The two sides will also create 4 subcommittees to ensure the safety of South Korean workers in Gaeseong. One subcommittee will ensure the safety of South Korean workers in Gaeseong. One will look after the protection of South Korean assets. Another will work toward raising the international competitiveness of the complex. And the last will oversee commutes in and out of the complex, communications, and the customs of South Korean workers. The subcommittees will hold meetings at least once a month. An official at Seoul's Unification Ministry said that once the Joint Committee holds its first meeting, it'll be only a matter of time before operations resume at the business park, as the issue will surely be discussed. Hwang Sung-hee, Arirang News.
The military chiefs of the ASEAN nations wrapped up the second round of their defense ministers meeting plus in Brunei this afternoon with a joint communique that called for denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. The joint declaration, along with other key items, indirectly urged North Korea to fully comply with UN restrictions, citing its continued nuclear and missile threats to the regional security. However, the words North Korea were not stated. South Korean Defense Minister Kim Kwan-jin, in his keynote speech, reiterated the security risks Pyongyang's nuclear and missile programs pose to the world. He also urged ASEAN member nations to join hands in urging the North to abide by its international obligations. Washington has stressed the visit of a U.S. Special Envoy to North Korea Friday is nothing more than a humanitarian mission to bring a detained American citizen home and is not linked to any other issues between the two countries. The State Department says Human Rights Envoy Robert King will seek amnesty for Kenneth Bae, who was sentenced earlier this year to 15 years of hard labor in the North. Bae is accused of having tried to topple the regime. Washington is pushing for Bae, who is believed to be very ill, to be released so he can be flown home for much-needed medical attention. The department added that King's visit has no connection to international efforts to reopen the six-party talks aimed at denuclearizing North Korea.
President Park continued on with her economic drive this Thursday by holding a meeting with economic experts and inviting leaders from medium-sized companies to listen to what they had to say. Our presidential office correspondent, Jin-ju, has more.
President Park on Thursday reiterated the two major focuses of her administration's economic policy: restoring the country's shrinking middle class and realizing a creative economy. During a meeting of the National Economic Advisory Council Thursday morning, President Park said her government would put top priority on increasing the middle class to 70% of the nation's population and the employment rate to 70%. She said the two goals go hand in hand, as employment will be the foundation for increasing the middle class. The president put forth some ideas to reach this goal: creating high-quality part-time jobs, improving the working environment for women with children, and supporting dual-income families. President Park stressed that realizing a creative economy is not separate from her goal of increasing the middle class, as the creative economy would play a key role in reaching a 70% employment rate, which is the basis for middle-class expansion. The president pledged to set up a regulatory infrastructure so that individuals and the private sector can fully display their creativity. Later in the day, President Park met with leaders of mid-sized enterprises and promised that support, such as in R&D and taxation, will continuously be provided even after small firms grow into mid-sized companies. She said that she is well aware of the hardships they face, pointing out that 77 types of government support measures provided to small companies disappear all of a sudden after they grow into mid-sized enterprises, while 20 new regulations are imposed on them. President Park described mid-sized firms as the backbone of the economy, saying they greatly contribute to job creation and economic revitalization. She promised to set up a system, what she called a growth ladder, in which small firms could steadily grow into mid-sized firms and mid-sized firms into conglomerates. Jin-ju, Arirang News.
Korea's current account, the broadest measure of the nation's trade with the rest of the world, posted a surplus for the 18th straight month in July. The Bank of Korea said Thursday that the nation recorded a surplus of $6.7 billion last month, down from $7.2 billion in June. The central bank said the lower surplus in July came as spending on overseas travel rose during the summer vacation season. Overseas shipments rose nearly 4% from the same period a year earlier to $48 billion, while imports gained 3.5% to $42 billion. While Korea's largest automaker Hyundai is suffering from disruptions caused by extended strikes of its workers at home, the company's sales in neighboring China are growing at their fastest pace of the year. Our Hwang Ji-hye has the details.
Hyundai and Kia's high-speed growth in China seems unstoppable. Hyundai Motor, the world's fifth largest automaker, and its affiliate Kia Motors reported sales last Friday of 1 million units in China so far this year, the fastest pace since it entered the market. The automakers had sold around 900,000 cars through July. Hyundai has been posting sales of 1 million units in shorter periods of time for the past 3 years, but this time, for the first time, it shortened its pace by 2 months. Despite rising concerns about China's auto market due to the nation's slowing growth, the auto market grew over 15% in the January to July period from the same period a year earlier. And Hyundai and Kia have almost doubled that growth pace, growing 30%. That's the third fastest growth rate among automakers selling cars in China after U.S. automaker Ford and China's local Great Wall Motors. Hyundai and Kia's rapid growth in China comes from rising sales of new models like the K3 and China's expanding sport utility vehicle market, which has raised sales of Hyundai's Tucson by 75% and Kia's Sportage by 30% during the same period. Hyundai and Kia plan to improve their brand image by engaging in social activities and using targeted marketing strategies to maintain their growth momentum in China. The car makers also plan to expand their factories in the nation. Hwang Ji-hye, Arirang News.
For the first time since nationwide protests ended the military-backed dictatorship in Korea in the late 1980s, politicians have been charged with sedition in Korea. The National Intelligence Service has placed a travel ban on 14 people, including lawmaker Lee Seok-gi of the Unified Progressive Party, on charges of conspiring a rebellion and violating the national security law. Arirang reports.
It's the first time a sitting member of parliament is under investigation for sedition in Korea. Lawmaker Lee Seok-gi of the ultra-left Unified Progressive Party and 13 other left-leaning figures are accused of setting up a secret organization to overthrow the South Korean legal systems. The National Intelligence Service has placed a travel ban on the 14 people. Already, 3 officials of Lee's party have been arrested on sedition charges. The spy agency says it has secured audio files of the secret organization, conspiring to arm itself with weapons and to stage sabotage attacks on crucial communications facilities. The group was also accused of planning to block major railways to delay movements of people and supplies in the event of a war with North Korea. Representative Lee Seok-gi, who is at the center of the conspiracy, on Thursday denied the charges. He said in a meeting of party leaders that the spy agency, which has been criticized for meddling in last year's presidential election, fabricated the case as part of political repression against left-leaning politicians. Yurian, Arirang News.
In an interview aired on a U.S. TV network Wednesday, U.S. President Barack Obama concluded the Syrian government used chemical weapons against civilians. With the backing of NATO and not the UN Security Council, Washington is preparing to carry out tailored strikes to deter future use of chemical weapons in Syria. Our Connie Lee has more.
In an interview with U.S. network PBS on Wednesday, President Barack Obama said Washington has concluded that the Syrian government is responsible for the recent chemical attacks that killed hundreds of civilians near Damascus.
Well, what's happened has been heartbreaking.
President Obama said no decision has been made yet, but he was urging a limited military strike against Syria to deter future use of chemical weapons.
There is a prospect, a possibility in which chemical weapons that can have devastating effects could be directed at us. And we want to make sure that that does not happen.
The president's comments come after Western nations failed to convince Russia at a UN meeting to support a resolution for military action against Syria. In the UK, though, Prime Minister David Cameron's leadership was challenged on Wednesday as he was forced to delay his plans for imminent military strike. The opposition Labour Party said it wanted more scrutiny over its decision of such magnitude. As expected, however, the key Western military alliance, NATO, gave its backing for intervention, with NATO Secretary General saying President Assad needs to be held accountable for his actions. Earlier on Wednesday, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon appealed for world powers to hold off on any military action, at least until chemical inspectors in Syria have finished their work. Connie Lee, Arirang News.
The world's nuclear watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Agency, is demanding Japan to stop sending confusing messages about the nuclear crisis at its Fukushima plant and explain what is happening there in detail. The IAEA wants to know why the recently revealed tank leak of 300 tons of highly radioactive water warranted a level 3 on the International Nuclear Event Scale when no other incident had justified a rating since the March 2011 meltdown. Rubber stamping its decision Wednesday, Japan's nuclear agency said it had no clue how much contaminated water had leaked, how radioactive it was, or where it went. It added it may revise its decision based on information it receives from the plant's operator TEPCO. The initial disaster was rated the highest level 7 on the international scale, the same as the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. There is growing concern about the safety of the fish and other seafood on the average Korean's dinner table these days. The radiation leaks at Fukushima have sparked a public food scare in Korea, with many consumers wondering whether it is safe to eat fish from Japan or anywhere at all. Our Song Ji-san reports.
It's an early morning at this large fisheries wholesale market in Seoul. It should be bustling with retailers and consumers, but far fewer transactions are being made as people are refraining from buying fish over concerns about radiation. Consumer concerns about the safety of Japanese fish imports are growing here in Korea, with more and more people steering clear of seafood from Japan.
Consumers ask first whether the product is from Japan. They become extremely sensitive, so they won't purchase anything, even the smallest fish, if it's from Japan.
Our sales have dropped by 80 to 90%. Seoul's Fisheries Corporation conducts radiation screenings every day, and the results come out normal all the time. But consumers seem to be rejecting all Japanese products.
According to data from Korea's large supermarket chains, sales of pollock and mackerel, which were found to contain traces of cesium in some Japanese imports, dropped by 60% and 29% respectively in August from the same month a year ago. In an attempt to ease public concerns about the issue, the government has boosted the number of inspections on seafood imports from once to twice a week. But this simple step is not enough to put people's minds at ease, with many fearing that with hundreds of tons of highly radioactive water pouring into the ocean, it is bound to circulate around the world.
Contaminated fishes are not here in yet, but the problem is going to be starting probably from next month, for example, because now the plants are beginning to leak those highly contaminated water.
Tokyo sent a report on the latest radiation leak and its planned countermeasures to Seoul on Wednesday, more than 2 weeks after Korea made an official request. Song Ji-sun, Arirang News.
Emmanuel Pastreich, professor of humanities at Kyung University, is a renowned American expert on East Asia, and he speaks of what he would like to call Korea Premium in his recently published book titled A Different Republic of Korea, about which only Koreans are ignorant, a Harvard PhD's views on Korea's potential. He says Koreans have not yet discovered this premium.
That's right. It's a very intriguing title right there and a very intriguing read. In the book, Professor Pastreich talks about traditional and contemporary Korean culture, architecture, holidays, and the Korean language, which he says are great sources of a Korea premium. So let's get the details on that by turning to the source. Good evening, Professor.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Welcome back. So could you please start us off by telling us about your new book? This is your third book in Korean, I believe.
Correct.
What inspired you this time to write this one?
Well, there is so much in the Korean tradition which really hasn't been highlighted sufficiently in Korea. And I think as we look forward in Korea beyond smartphones, we see that culture itself as really being the potential for Korea.
So what is it about Korea that intrigues you? Is it Korea's unique development experience? What makes Korea a great nation, in your opinion?
So, of course, we normally speak about this tremendous fast growth of Korea, say, from the 1960s on, and that is tremendous. But I think we have to go back further, that if you didn't have the knowledge and also the thinking, the ability to make long-term plans, then that sort of rapid growth would not have been possible. So we really need to go back into the tradition of Confucianism and the ideas and thoughts that people had back in the 17th, 18th century, which were the foundations for rapid growth. Not to deny the importance of rapid growth, but just to say, as they often say, Somalia and Korea were the same in 1953 in terms of GNP, but they were not the same. I mean, Korea had a tremendous intellectual, artistic tradition.
Right, you seem to come up with new terms every time you write new books. This one, we have another term here that we would like you to talk to us like we're 4-year-olds so we can really understand what it's about. You talked about an inferiority complex that you would like to title the shrimp complex, about a nation sandwiched between what we call great world powers like Japan, Russia, and China. Could you elaborate more on that?
Well, the shrimp complex, yes. So there's a famous phrase in Korea that if whales fight, the shrimp will have its back broken. And this is what Koreans often think, how they imagine Korea itself. But I think it really is becoming a myth. That Korea has tremendous advanced technology. Its industry, Samsung or LG or Hyundai, are global players. And in fact, recently, Korea has had more access to finance than many other companies around the world. So Korea is no shrimp. But if you think of yourself as a shrimp, then you have trouble taking advantage of some of the assets that you actually have. So that's what I was concerned with, what many Koreans are concerned with, is how you move beyond this sort of sense of yourself as this little country and recognize what Korea has already achieved and what its potential is.
Right. I think we still have a lot of individuals out there who still don't think big enough. Right. Or think outside of Korea. They want to be the best here, but they do not think about venturing outside uncharted territories still yet.
Right, so that shrimp complex, I think that kind of goes well with the idea of this Korea discount, this idea that Korean stocks are undervalued, but you are talking about the Korea premium. So what then is a Korea premium, and how do the nation's cultural assets factor in?
Right, so I like to focus on the cultural part, not to say whether stocks are undervalued. That's a short-term issue. The long-term issue is that there's tremendous potential within the Korean tradition itself. So Korea didn't grow rapidly because of President Park Chung-hee. It grew rapidly because it had this tremendous intellectual tradition of which Park Chung-hee was a product, right, of how to make long-term plans, statecraft, for example. The Chosun dynasty, 500 years of peace, extremely well administered. And then in terms of the Buddhist tradition, there are tremendous aspects of Buddhism, for example, which disappeared in China and elsewhere, which have only been preserved in Korea. We have all sorts of, say, organic farming. Seoul or Hanyang used to be the great sort of environmental eco-city, right, in which everything was perfectly preserved and recycled. There's a tremendous sort of a tradition there, but because of this process of modernity, many Koreans have assumed, well, not just Koreans, somehow that there was this ancient Korea which we threw away, and we've moved on to this new modern Korea, and everything before the 20th century really it's sort of amusing, but it doesn't have any relevance. And what we want to say is that there's tremendous wealth there. And if we can take some of those aspects of Confucianism, Buddhism, traditional culture, and marry them with modern technology and potential, that maybe there's a sort of a new cultural potential in Korea.
Right, marrying or marinating the past with our present and the future.
Right.
We have been dwelling a little bit on being tech-savvy and the most wired nation in the world, so maybe we want to draw some inspiration from the past, like you've mentioned, Professor. What can we do other than that to better convey the excellency of the Korean cultural assets and the country as a whole to the international community without any distortions?
Right. So in terms of the culture itself, as you mentioned, Korea is a very tech-savvy society, and I'm certainly not advocating we should just go back to the past, right? Just to say that there are some parts of that tradition which, if we can combine them with this, have great potential. In terms of accurately portraying Korea, the first thing is to say Korea has a history, right? It didn't just start, 50 years ago, and we have to make sure that that history is both accurately represented. As you know, there have been many efforts to distort Korean history, which have to be countered, but also we have to expand it. I mean, say, ignorant Americans, we know maybe a little bit about Korea. We can recognize Samsung and Hyundai now, but we can't name a famous Korean, right? I mean, maybe, the president, or unfortunately sometimes more the North Korean head, because we hear it more on TV. But we can't think of someone like Sejong and say this is a great global cultural figure. So I think that's really the task for us, is to make the Korean tradition itself, that someone growing up in Africa would say, oh, well, my heroes are, Gandhi and Einstein and Sejong. When we get there, then we will have succeeded.
Right. We need to dig into our treasure trove, which is some of the things in our past that we take for granted and use it for our future. Thank you so much for being here with us, Professor Pastraj. We look forward to having you back here soon.
A pleasure.
That was Professor Emmanuel Pastraj of Kyungki University, author of the book A Different Republic of Korea, about which only Koreans are ignorant.
And that's a wrap for us. Thank you for staying with us. This has been Daniel Che.
And I'm Kim Hyun-ji. Stay tuned to Arirang for more news coming up.